Every few months, certain topics get recycled on the internet, specifically in TTRPG Twitter and YouTube. You know the type. Fudging dice rolls, the legitimacy of railroading, and whether some species should be ontologically evil. Some of these controversial topics are more serious than others. Some require significantly more nuance. But what I want to do today is provide a basic common sense view on all of them. All the topics that I can think of. And if you disagree with me, which you almost inevitably will on at least one of these, that's fine. I'm not telling you how to live your life, and please do feel free to share other reasonable, well-reasoned takes in the comments. I will ask you to avoid vitriol, prejudice, and personal attacks, though. Everything I do on this channel is to try and present a reasonable, measured opinion, so I hope, as my community, we're able to kind of make that happen in the comments as well. So without further ado, let's go. This is such a bad idea. We're starting with disability. Of course, there are many forms of disability and disabilities. I mean, hell, I'm considered disabled by the laws of my own country due to a medical condition. And the experiences of people with disabilities can be so different and varied, even among people who seem to have similar conditions from the outside. See, for a long time there's been a segment of the community that argues that disabled people have no space to exist in a D&D world, especially as adventurers. This is nonsense. With the plethora of magical and technological options presented in almost every D&D setting out there, there are so many reasonable accommodations that can be made for people with disabilities. And especially if you ascribe to the idea that player characters are the greatest heroes possible, the most powerful movers and shakers in a world, it would be foolish to suggest replacing the spellcaster with paraplegia with a less potent spellcaster. When the fabled hero loses a hand or is cursed with some disease that causes him immense permanent pain, fantasy media doesn't just drop them in favour of the next guy. Can you imagine how crap Star Wars Episode 6 would be if Luke were sidelined for the entire film because of his disabling injury? In D&D worlds, some disabilities can legitimately be reversed. All can be reasonably accommodated for, and yet more can either be mitigated or turned into a strength. The classic blind fighter dropping a smoke cloud on their position, for example. With the amount of magical accommodations that are available to people with disabilities in a D&D styled world, it's a reasonable argument to say that people with disabilities may thrive more in the fantasy worlds of D&D than they do here. Side note, combat wheelchairs are awesome. If a Beastmaster can ride a bear and an Artificer can ride their Steel Defender, why the hell can't a character be mounted on what is essentially a horseless chariot? Stairs? Floating Disc is a ritual spell in 5th edition. Or, you know, you've got allies to help you up. Or perhaps the chair user can walk up the stairs themselves. Not everyone who uses a wheelchair for support has paraplegia. Fudging dice rolls is a practice often used by dungeon masters who are concerned about telling a really good story. There's degrees to the concept of fudging, from adding 3 extra hit points to a boss monster to make sure the NPC guardsman doesn't, or maybe does, get the last hit, to changing a dice result to ensure that you don't crit a character who's already failed 1 death save. I don't fudge dice. I never have, I never will, but I do understand the impulse. The issue I think here is twofold: lacking trust and over-rolling. Generally, when DMs fudge, it's not a narrative decision. It's a social one. You don't want to kill the vibe, hurt someone's feelings, or leave the session on a really down note. But if you play with mature and well-adjusted peers, the urge to fudge will reduce. Because you know that no one's going to ruin the night because their character died to bad luck. If you can trust in your entire table to handle emotional situations maturely, then you can tell the story of the dice far better. Of course, you're also needing to trust in your own ability as a DM to spin a compelling narrative out of failure, so you've got to trust in yourself too. But that's only half of the solution. I believe that most game masters are asking for far too many rolls. If a movement has been foreshadowed, meticulously planned, or is the culmination of some arc fitting right into the story perfectly, then what use is rolling a dice? You or your players, or both of you, have already succeeded in shaping a compelling narrative over sessions and sessions and sessions of planning. You've got to this moment through a mix of roles and plans and roleplay. So let it happen sometimes. Also, massaging HP for narrative reasons is fine, as long as you're not cheating your players out of a legitimate earned result. Safety tools aren't controversial, even though a small subsection of people on the internet really want them to be. If your friend's mum gets eaten by a bear, you're probably not going to run a bear attack on a defenseless village in the next session, unless you're, Senor Chang, otherwise known as a psychopath. Safety tools is just a term that we use for the formalising of these sorts of social boundaries that are usually implicit. And they're especially useful as an explicit term for people who aren't so good at, interpreting social boundaries. It's far easier to have a pre-agreed list of topic or pre-agreed method of expressing discomfort than having to negotiate that conversation, that difficult sort of conversation, in real time, every time. Safety tools are just another word for planning ahead to make your life easier. Speaking of discomfort, we now move to a list of topics for which my answer is broadly the same. If you and the people at your table are willing to explore this, and have expressed interest in doing so, then have at it. Making sure that sufficient safety tools are in place. Being more than ready to step out of the action to relieve tension, make jokes, or simply remind each other that this is a game and social event. However, if you do not or cannot trust your table, or even one member of it to be a mature and honest participant in this aspect of the game. For example, if you suspect someone is lying about their level of comfort so as not to ruin the fun of everyone else. Or, more heinously, someone's pushing far further than pre-agreed limits, that must be shut down. Those behaviours cannot exist in this situation. It may even be worth speaking with players beforehand individually to make sure they're all going to be comfortable in speaking up if things go wrong, or making the accommodation or arrangement to speak proactively on behalf of more shy players. A hard stop is always easier than a retcon, and a retcon is always far easier than dealing with resentments or trauma at your table. Also, a little extra note on PvP. Make sure, if it does break out, that characters have enough shared goals, history or experience to get back together if that is deemed necessary afterwards. I very much regret starting a new player's introduction to a group with an oppositional PvP scenario. It was not my brightest moment. Playing with hidden DCs and death saves can be a great idea, as can making both of those things public. Honestly, for a good DM, both of these options should be in the toolbox, broken out at different times. A public DC for a really important role can build massive hype and anticipation when used sparingly, while a hidden DC can evoke tension, mystery, and even despair. One is not better than the other. Railroading too can have a place. It's a useful tool, especially for less confident DMs, to get moving without the overwhelming fear of being forced to improvise. Railroady approaches are even kind of broadly encouraged by official modules, The Wild Beyond the Witchlight, for example. The issues with railroading come when it's used exclusively and obviously. Exclusively and transparently only using one singular technique is kind of a hallmark of beginner DMs, which helps solidify the broad stereotype against the railroad. Having tracks laid out ahead to get the party to the next point in the story or the next location isn't a bad thing. It's just worth remembering that some stations are nexus points to get to various different tracks. Tracks sometimes split at forks. And even if you're on a single track with one station somewhere in the middle with no other railroads leading off from it, you might still end up getting off the train and exploring for a bit before hopping back on the railroad. Build your first adventure as a railroad, with some single track destinations to hop off the train and explore. And if this adventure becomes a campaign, then you build a nexus station with multiple tracks leading off. And eventually the tracks will get less and less well defined, more fuzzy, and you can have more fun with it. But honestly, there's still always room in a DM's toolbox for a good old railroad if you need the players to get somewhere. The best campaigns use a mixture of railroading and sandboxes. Before we get to the edition wars, I think there's just a few more topics really to cover. Now, I've got a whole video on monster personhood that you should probably check out. Is a goblin a person? But I do need to address one specific controversy. Should entire species of sapient creature be monstrous and evil? This discourse has recently been applied to orcs in their 2024 transition to a full player species. Frankly, if a species is intelligent and social enough to create an organised society with individual agency, distinct cultural roles, communication, childcare, and craft, whether that society is organised around pillaging other species or doing charity conservation work, is completely irrelevant. Because that culture, if it is that complex and well developed, is not a monolith. Where culture exists, there is counterculture. There is accepted morality, and there are taboos. But you may be thinking, but what about totalitarian fascism? Surely the drow are kept in line as a ultimate evil monolith. Well, fascism breeds dissent. Always. It always fails. Besides, even if a culture is forced to be evil by a controlling evil deity, the act of conforming to divine and social orthodoxy in that society is, in that society's view of ethics, a virtuous one. And by defining what is virtuous, you automatically create its opposite as an ideological pole. Drow virtue may well be found in abusing other species, so the forbidden drow vice may be found in mercy. In the creation of a philosophy or idea or way of living, you create the opposite as well. And when ideas exist, people somewhere will act on them. Now let's talk about banning species or classes or certain spells. I get it, but I don't generally do it. Silvery Barbs is a popular choice at my tables for good reason. It is overtuned. And in the 2014 version of 5th edition, a lot of my players ended up using half-elves. The thing for me is that balance is not that important in a game like Dungeons & Dragons, when the DM's thumb can so heavily tip the scale with, a custom magic item or two. I mean, I don't even balance my encounters, really. I expect that my players will find a way through, which they almost always do, or effect a retreat, which they never think to do. Besides, I quite like a high power level at my tables anyway, so I don't see the need to ban things for balance reasons. For those who ban things for setting reasons, though, I do also understand that. I've run a very long campaign set in Athos, one of the most restrictive settings ever published for D&D, and it was a lot of fun. That specific table was well suited to a more restricted, grounded world with some setting required restrictions, as they were more focused on narrative, collaborative storytelling, and politicking than set-piece fights, dungeon delving, and big bad evil guys. The more your players care about the mechanics of the game, especially combat, the harder it is going to be to make restrictions in class or species or spell choices. The more it feels like some of the game's mechanics have just been gutted and are now missing. A decent compromise I find is reskinning and reflavouring. Tieflings don't exist in my version of Athos, but had it been really wanted, a child born in the midday sun, being touched and infused with the energy of light and heat, giving them some form of minor psionic talent to give them control over the power of lights, so perhaps innate dark vision and the ability to cast the darkness spell at level 5, and perhaps just retheming Hellish Rebuke around like a psionic backlash. I mean, that seems like it gets pretty close to me. But ultimately, let's tackle the OGL drama. Obviously, I support an open perpetual license for creatives to publish and monetize content which is compatible with D&D's game rules and general IP. This specific hobby is, however, notoriously difficult to monetize for its owning company, while independent creators with smaller teams often continue to see success in projects throughout the space. This is because fundamentally D&D's purchase cycle is broadly incompatible with the requirements of a publicly traded company. Core books sell the best. Each new edition, the core books sell the best, and subsequent books just don't reach the same heights. This leads to a slow, steady dwindling in sales until the next edition is published and the next big purchase of books. As players would balk at a new edition every few years, the company must endure long periods of lackluster or negative growth, often buoyed up really only by flashes of interest surrounding massive IPs, such as Stranger Things or Baldur's Gate 3. A consistent downward trend from the start of an edition to the next edition's bump again, mixed with the unpredictable spikes that come from media properties that aren't made in-house by the Wizards of the Coast team, all leads D&D to feel like a very risky proposition, like an albatross around the neck of a company that is trying to seek consistent growth in the stock market. And attempting to bring fan content with its, impressive Kickstarter numbers and genuine fan engagement into the profit cycle more directly makes a lot of sense from exactly that perspective. The issue is D&D has cultivated a fan base which is endlessly creative and incentivized to homebrew, or at the very least use non-official materials. So such a blatant attempt to muscle in on the thriving and creative professional independent space violated the game's kind of ethos. This problem isn't going away either as long as D&D is managed by a publicly traded company. So all this is really likely to happen again in some form or another. Then again, non-public companies that weren't able to weather the volatility of D&D's kind of ebb and flow model didn't end up doing very well last time either. Finally, the edition wars. I've not played every edition of this game, nor do I really want to. My first experience of Dungeons & Dragons was pouring through this boxed set from 1994 as a kid, trying to learn the rules as best as I could on my own, and thinking that D&D was some sort of choose-your-own-adventure due to the frankly quite baffling rulebook design included in this product. I also played this, which didn't really help me understand the game any better. And finally, as my kind of third starting point into Dungeons & Dragons, I started reading Order of the Stick, which I think gave me a strong mechanical and trope-based understanding of what D&D is kind of all about. It is a damn good comic. Still today, I cannot, for the life of me, figure out what edition of the game this thing was trying to teach me. And the Order of a Stick is firmly a pastiche of 3.5, which has always intrigued me, although I do admit to having been intimidated by the volume of stuff and the seemingly significant knowledge flaw to build a competent character and to adjust for all of the difficulties of and complexities of the broad splat books of that sort of style of publishing. Most of my proper D&D experience has been with 5th edition, and for its many faults, it is certainly the best edition to be playing at the moment, because you can actually get a group committed to a campaign without a sacrifice to the gods. It's also, in my opinion, probably the best written edition. The use of natural language in the rules is a very, very welcome touch. And I will say the layout of stat blocks is incredibly user-friendly. Honestly, stat blocks is kind of part of how I judge other editions. I've read an awful lot of stat blocks in my quest to find some of the weirdest monsters to throw at my party from all previous editions. I mean, I'm still not entirely sure what a Sue ability is. Actually, since writing that line, I have looked this up, and I do want to recant a little bit of what I said here, because it actually would be genuinely quite useful in 5th edition to have a handy little acronym or something to indicate when an ability is supernatural or spell-like, because a lot of spells like Dispel Magic really need that distinction. Either way, I regret to inform you that since 5th edition is what people generally know and are playing right now, and it's also what generally people click on, it's still my primary focus, even though I have played and do play other games. It also helps that I know it the best, which helps me feel qualified to talk about it to some extent on the internet to an audience that I've kind of cultivated of massive pedants. That is not an insult. Also, no, I've never played Pathfinder. I read all the core rulebooks for the 2nd edition, and I wasn't sold, to be honest. It's the barrier to entry thing. We'll see if I ever get over it, or get the time to get over it. Either way, that's all the controversial topics I could really think of for this video. As well as getting some topics from some of my Dungeon Tuber friends. So now you know my reasonably reasoned opinions on everything. Again, let's all be civil. I hope some of this was helpful, and I hope this video means I won't have to engage with any of these topics in the future, but we'll see if I need to make a correction. There's a strong likelihood I've said something stupid in this video and just not spotted it, due to my own intellectual biases. In any case, with all that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the TTRPGs. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.